desire, and Spirit burn right through. Spirit burn, Spirit burn, Spirit burn, Spirit burn. Glorify your name. Let your kingdom rule over our hearts. Father, show your face. Let the light of heaven shine from us. Rushing wind blow through this place and pierce this worldly veil. Fill our streets with your sweet salvation, love that never fails. Spirit burn, Spirit burn, Spirit burn. Glorify your name. Let your kingdom rule over our hearts. Father, show your face. Let the light of heaven shine from us. Glorify, glorify your name. Let your kingdom rule over our hearts. Father, show your face. Let the light of heaven shine from us. Holy fire, fall like rain. Mark your church, so bear your name. Come and bow. Come and reign, sanctify, stir your saints, glorify your name. Let your kingdom rule over our hearts. Father, show your face. Let the light of heaven shine from us. 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 Yeah, thank you, God. Praise your name, Jesus. Thank you, I hear this morning. Why didn't you turn around and hug someone and say hi to someone this morning?
All that busyness, I forgot to print my notes. Like losing my mind here. Good morning. It's great to see you guys this morning. Thank you. Love hecklers, especially today, and I'll tell you why in a second. Well, my name is Mike. I'm the senior pastor here. I just want to welcome you if you're new with us. So grateful you're here. We'd love to meet you and say hi. If that is too intimidating, though, I get it, because pastors kind of intimidate people. I didn't know that until I became a pastor, and then I started realizing that some people call me father, and some people call me reverend, some people just turn the other way when they hear what I do, but I'm not as scary as I look. But if you don't want to meet, there are Connect cards in the seat backs in front of you, and you can fill that out, and it's a safer way to say hi, questions you have, or if you want to sign up for something. But as we get going today, a few announcements. And you'll see up here I have a laptop, which is because we've had such a full morning, and we're praying before the service. I forgot to print my notes. I've never preached with a computer up here, so this is going to be different. So we have a women's brunch coming up April 13th. We do those monthly on the third Saturday of the month. That's 9 a.m. We've also got baptisms happening coming up on Easter. So if you want to get in on baptisms, if you've never been baptized before, or never by your own choice, if you were too young to remember it, we'll consider including you in that as well. But that class began today. If you still want to get in on that, you can see me afterward. Let's see here. In 2 weeks or a week from this coming Friday, April 5th, we've got our next edition of Fire by Night. It's our Friday night worship time that we do here. We've done every other week for the winter months. And that's just a time, rather than sitting in rows and worshiping as we do like this with a stage and rows and a sound system, we gather in the foyer and we circle up. And the reason for that is that we create a participatory, collaborative, crowdsourced worship environment, and we'd love for you to check it out. We just had it Friday night, and wonderful time of prayer, worship, and some prayer ministry for one another. The next one is April 5th, 7 p.m. The youth group and families with teens do dinner beforehand at the Holzklaas. So if you can see them, are the Holzklaas in here today? There they are. All right. They're associate pastors here, work with youth and families and other stuff, but see them if you have teenagers for the next youth dinner. Well, today we also, before we get into the sermon, I just want to, we're going to do something a little different this morning. We're going to kind of do church off the rails, and we've been doing this series on 1 Corinthians called Church Unedited, and just looking at the real deal stories of the first century church in all its messy glory. And today we're going to try taking our service a little bit out of the ordinary, and anything could really happen here, or nothing could happen. We'll see as we get going. But at this point, I want to just make some space for involvement of somebody else, and we'll see what happens with that. But as you know, there's been just some historic, unprecedented tragedies in the last few weeks. Of course, there's flooding here in the U.S., in Nebraska, and a few other states. They're saying this could just be like a record year for flooding, but across the sea in eastern Africa, the flooding has been just absolutely horrific. You may have seen the news with Mozambique, and Zimbabwe's been affected, where we've been involved for a couple decades planting churches, and massive loss of life, and just there's quite a few vineyard churches and sister churches we have in Mozambique who are just like they might just be completely obliterated. Like the whole town is gone. The pastors haven't been, and churches haven't been accounted for, and the leader of the vineyard in Mozambique said, we just don't know. Like, we don't know what's out there, what's going to be back there after the floodwaters recede. And of course, there's just over the last couple of weeks too, we've just seen the tragedy unfold in New Zealand, and the stories coming out about that, and the wonderful good news of just seeing the humanity of people gathering around and saying this isn't okay, and encircling the mosque, arm to arm, and just showing solidarity and wearing head coverings. So there's always, we always hope to see and pray to see God at work in those kind of times, in tragedy. But I want to invite somebody up here this morning to just pray for those situations. So if anybody here is feeling really bold this morning, no one has been pre-selected for this activity. So like I said, anything could happen. I might have to wrestle the microphone out of somebody's hand in a minute. But if you'd like to come up and pray for Mozambique, Zimbabwe, any of these things, help yourself. It's not as scary up here as it feels. Because I know if you don't come soon, Carol is going to come. She has a heart for Zimbabwe. Hey, Mark. Hey, buddy. Right. We got to. Well, with that, usually we're a little more orderly here, but as I said, we're going to try some things a little different today. Is there anybody that likes to read aloud? I'm just going to offer this up there. Does anybody really likes to read aloud? Yeah? I can't really see because of the glare. Liz? Okay. Liz, come on up. Let's join Liz. Liz Kozel, everybody. One of our ministry leaders for a long time. One of my dear friends. And our reading today is from 1 Corinthians. Can you see that okay? Oh, where? No, right here. Right this side.
each of you has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so that the church may be built up. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues. But everything should be done in a fitting and orderly way. This is the good and gracious word of the Lord for his people.
Good. All right, we're good. Well, today we are, as we continue a series on 1 Corinthians, we're talking about how church services were run in the first century, in the early church, which is a little risky because if there's one thing I've learned as a pastor, it's that people don't like it when you mess with their church service. You can change the coffee, you can change the kids' ministry curriculum. I mean, you can change the building around, you can even change to a different translation of the Bible, but change the worship service order, look out. I mean, that makes us really nervous. Apparently, many years ago, there were worship wars in some churches. And I never went through that, and I can't imagine the bloodshed and the misery that accompanied worship wars. But it's a tough topic. But today's text also allows us to address another fun topic: the gift of tongues. Anybody want to talk about the gift of tongues? Some of you do. Other people are like, oh my gosh, here we go. You better buckle up. And I say fun topic because as strange and weird and wonderful as the Bible is, people can't quite seem to get over the gift of tongues. We have a whole Bible filled with all sorts of strange, hard to believe things, like this great flood and Noah who builds an ark and saves the animals and the plagues of Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea and the Exodus with wild stories, and not even to mention the basics of a God that created everything out of nothing or a man that came back from death. Yet what really gets people nervous is tongues. It's odd, isn't it? Because I have a top 10 list of questions that people ask me as a pastor about the church. I get asked all the time, what's your church like? And do you speak in tongues is probably number 7 or something. It comes up, and usually it goes like this. Well, you seem to be pretty normal. What kind of church is yours? It's not one of those churches that speaks in tongues, is it? We wouldn't want that. It's not, and I have to say, it's a topic that I've noticed. Just sort of, people categorize churches by these sorts of things, like a tongue speaker. No, are you a liturgy church? It's one of the categories we put churches in, but. When I get asked this question, I typically will, I'll just say, if you come on a Sunday, you're probably not going to hear a lot of speaking in tongues. You never know what the cat dragged in. But personally, praying in tongues is pretty much one of my favorite ways to pray. And if that's it. I know I seem normal, but yes, praying in tongues, I've been known to do that a time or two. And I get the difficulty folks have with it, though, because when I was a kid, we visited a church, a vineyard church, for the first time out in Holland. And I think I was an early teenager, and in the middle of the service, somebody started bellowing out in some unknown language, and I'd never heard of such a thing. Never heard it live, never even heard there was such a thing. And I remember turning to my parents what is wrong with her? What is going on with that woman? But I've come to realize over the years that the gift of tongues is pretty much one of the great gifts God gives us. It's especially, I think it's probably the greatest gift if you're praying challenged, as I feel I am. I don't know about you. I know pastors aren't really supposed to say this, but growing up in church, I really got bored at prayer meetings. And sometimes I still get really bored at prayer meetings. And I even get bored when I'm trying to pray by myself. After 2 or 3 minutes, Like my mind starts wandering, and I'm like, why was I sitting here again with my hands folded? I have a hard time sticking with prayer. And oftentimes, the prayers I grew up praying felt a little bit like building spreadsheets for God, which is, I don't know, if you think spreadsheets are fun, maybe the accountants here do. God bless you, but I don't like spreadsheets. And praying felt like building spreadsheets for God. Like, I just got to list out everything in every category that I can think to say to God. And when I've run out, I got to think of a few more, alternative ways to say it. And, really, after about 3 minutes, I'm just done and my mind's wandering. Does that ever happen to you? A few of you? Well, then that was when I really began to have an appreciation for tongues. I discovered praying in tongues. And what first got me interested was reading Jackie Pullinger's biography. And I think we've got a picture here. As you know, she's become a friend, but she was just this mythical legend when I was in high school. And, she's a British amateur missionary who went to Hong Kong at age 21. No training, no official backing, just her and her Bible and like $100. And went to Hong Kong and started trying to rescue heroin addicts from the streets and gang members who had like never worked an honest day in their life. And after several years, she tells a story about how she was ready to quit, and then she discovered something. That the one thing that really helped people like break the chemical dependency on heroin was teaching them to pray in tongues. And you can read all about it, and you really should, because we take people there now every November to serve with her. And over the past 50 years, she's just seen thousands of heroin addicts get free of heroin and other addictions. And it's fascinating to see in person, because there's just thousands, so much so that the communist Chinese government built her a monument. They call her the Angel of Hong Kong. It's just an incredible story. So when people ask me nowadays, what do you think of the gift of tongues? I usually say, well, it's really effective for getting people off of heroin. But yeah, it's since getting to know Jackie, it's fascinated me. Like, what is it going on here? And about 10 years ago, there was a study, a psychiatrist that developed a similar interest at University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Andrew Newberg did some research on and like brain scans of people speaking in tongues, as well as like Buddhist monks, meditating and all sorts of different things. And what he found was that when people prayed in like English, it was pretty much the same sort of brain imagery as just speaking. The cognitive parts of the brain, like everything was as you'd expect. But when people would pray in tongues, there was a different brain pattern. Like their frontal cortex, they kind of shut down and didn't register as much. Like their cognitive functions just kind of stopped. They were still talking, but something changed in their brain. And so, too, Buddhist monks, they actually had the opposite. Like, the frontal cortex got, like, really intensely focused. And what he suggested, as a person not really with a faith background, was that, like, I don't know what these people are doing, but something is happening. It's as if they're, like, relinquishing control of their speech, faculties when they pray. And that's probably why I find it so helpful. Because I find as in praying in tongues, I don't have to work so hard to like manufacture lots of things to say to God. I just talk in gibberish. Now, I don't mean to knock it. Probably shouldn't knock it till you've tried it. But like speaking in tongues we see it in the Bible clearly. Paul says, I wish I speak in tongues more than all of you. I wish you spoke in tongues. But it's a strange thing. And quite honestly, after like 10 or 15 years of practicing this as a gift and really a practice in prayer, there's still times I think, am I just crazy? Because I might be making this up. Like, I'm not 100% sure that I'm not. And yet, I can see demonstrable positive effects in my life of prayer, in my sense of connection to God. I can see, I'm not sure how it works, but I'm sure that it works. Now, if you got more questions about that, I'd love to talk all about that this morning, but chapter 14 gives us a lot of ground to cover, and tongues is just one part of it. And as much as, the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the tongues, or whether it's prophecy or healing or any of the other gifts of the Spirit Paul talks about, as much as they might make us nervous, it's very hard to get around it in the Bible. These things were entirely common in the New Testament church. These were regular things in the New Testament church. So much so that scholars will say, like Paul could not have imagined a church without this stuff. Paul tells us in verse 25 that spiritual gifts are given so that people would know that God is really among you. Like when people come in, they would know God is really among you. And if not for the prevalence of this sort of thing in the early church, none of us would be sitting here today. None of us would be here today if not for the prevalence of gifts. It's a fact of history that the early church grew from just a few hundred witnesses to the resurrection, and over 300 years grew to about 10 million people, is the estimate. And over the next 40 years, once it was finally legalized, it grew to almost 40 million or 50 million, which was well over half of the Roman Empire. But one of the most significant factors historians point to, even if they're not sure that it's real, it's the claims about supernatural gifts account for the enthusiasm about the church and the spread of gospel in the church. None of us would be sitting here if not for the word on the street that God is still among you. Now, growing up, I was part of a church that believed that the supernatural bits of the Bible were for a long time ago. Like they were things that just stopped. Maybe when the Bible was written or the last apostle died, we don't know. But still today, I would say that there's a truth to the fact that supernatural signs don't often seem as prevalent in our day as they do in the Bible, do they? It often seems that way. Depends on the circles you travel in, but it seems like they're not as prevalent today. But based on that, some folks, like those I grew up with, concluded that the gifts of the Spirit aren't really for today. And yet there is nothing in the Bible that remotely suggests that would be the case. There's actually nothing in the Bible that is based upon, which is odd because I grew up in a Bible church and we said we were all about the Bible. And yet on that one little point, we're like not into the Bible at all. Because the Bible gets weird at points and we have to decide, what do we do with that? Well, there's nothing in the Bible that suggests that it would get any less strange than it was back then. So why does it seem like there's more miracles in the Bible than there are in some circles today? Well, it's actually fairly well documented in history why these things kind of ebb and flow. And the first thing, this comes up in this passage, that spiritual gifts are actually crowded out by power and church politics. They're actually crowded out of church when the church prioritizes power in church politics. You can actually trace it through the first few centuries that the decline of miracles directly and just precisely corresponds to the increase in power and political wrangling that was happening in the church over position and leadership. Sometimes people today say, I don't really like organized religion. All the denominations and institutionalism, the church politics, I don't like that. I'm not even sure I like, church generally, because it gets just so ugly and divisive. Well, I have good news for you. The supernatural gifts of the Spirit are absolutely fatal to organized religion. They're fatal to organized religion. In the early days of the church, it was actually very hard for the church to get organized because it was hard for the church to become an institution with hierarchy and bishops, because the supernatural ministry of the Spirit was just so prevalent that you couldn't appoint just anyone to be a leader. Like, you couldn't just be elected to be a leader and then, stay in office until you die. It didn't work that way because leaders were just recognized by their giftedness. The church recognized that the Holy Spirit was giving out gifts to men and women and children and slaves and aristocrats and people with no education. I mean, and you just really couldn't buy yourself into a big position in the church just by knowing the right people. Leaders couldn't consolidate power and establish hierarchy, at least not very easily, not at the start. And still today, it seems like God is quite interested in frustrating our church politics by empowering, nobodies with gifts. And that, friends, is the story of the Vineyard movement back in the late 70s. The Vineyard was started by a guy, just a hard-drinking, drug-abusing 60s rock and roller who met Jesus in Vegas, of all places. And no, he wasn't on the corner begging for money. He actually had an encounter with Jesus in Vegas. And he discovered that God, over the years, was empowering him with the gift of healing. And here was a guy who just had really no business in the church hierarchy, who became a well-known, they'd put him on magazine covers, which he just refused to play the Christian celebrity game. But the Vineyard spread all over the world because things just happened when he prayed for people. Incredible things. And so the Vineyard spread. And throughout history, it seems like God he tends to do those things, like empowering people that are outside the institution of the church. That just frustrates our attempts at organizing hierarchy and power. Now, I remember years ago there was this elderly gentleman in our church, Steve, who came to the church and had a significant learning disability. And it was very childlike and simple. Developmentally, was probably close to a child. And he used to help out in all sorts of ordinary ways. He would take out the trash and hold open the door. But he wasn't exactly leadership material. He wasn't the guy you were going to, nominate to lead the board. And yet, I remember we were at this, we were having this very significant leadership meeting and making some big decisions. And we sort of opened it up for other people. I honestly don't know who invited him. And when I saw him, I thought, oh gosh, Steve's going to derail our meeting right into who knows where, telling one of his long stories or carrying on about something. And yet God was sort of frustrating my attempts at order and hierarchy and leadership, because at one point there was a time of open prayer, and Steve opened his mouth and he began to pray what was probably the most eloquent and articulate prayer I've ever heard, for 5 minutes and maybe 7 or 8 minutes. It just went on and on, just sort of pouring out of him. And I thought, there is no way he's thinking of this on the spot, and he's definitely not reading it. This has got to be God. This is supernatural. He just went on and on. It was profoundly theological. And that's what happens when the Spirit gives gifts. I've noticed that over the years, that God seems to have a way of really gifting and using people with developmental disabilities in remarkable ways. It just sort of frustrates our attempt at ordering the world the way we would, or the church the way we would. Spiritual gifts they're crowded out when the church prioritizes power and politics. They're also crowded out when the church prioritizes predictability in church programs. And in 1 Corinthians 14, we see this tension between the gifts, the spiritual gifts, and order has always been a big issue. Paul says, be eager to prophesy, don't forbid speaking in tongues, because presumably there were people ready to do that. But everything should be done in a fitting and orderly way. And best we know, in Corinth, they were into kind of some weird spirituality before they discovered Jesus. Best we know, many of the city of Corinth was, had many Greek mystery cults, they called them, that really celebrated sort of ecstatic spirituality, like losing control under the power of who knows what. That was pretty common in Corinth. And so when these people came to Jesus, that actually was sort of a point of pride in the church in Corinth. And we read about it in chapter 4, where Paul just lights into them and says, you guys are claiming you've already begun to reign. You're already so rich, like heaven has already come here in Corinth. And Paul just says, absolutely not. Like, you don't know what you're getting on about. And here in these few chapters, he just talks about the failure to love. Like, you can have all the gifts in the world, all the supernatural worship times, but if you have not love, you have nothing. And he says clearly here, the gifts of the Spirit are not helped by the sort of weirdness Corinthians were into. He says, at one point in this passage, he says, the spirit of prophets is subject to the prophets. Like, Christian spirituality is not heightened by you sort of like losing control or pretending to lose control or sort of losing yourself in the emotions of the moment. That's not Christian spirituality. And the church in Corinth, as much as we can tell, was just, they were getting out of control. Order was just fading into chaos. But that's not generally the case in modern American church, is it? I mean, not in most churches. I've seen Blues Brothers. I hear there's churches where people do flips in the air, but like that's not generally our problem, is it? Like too much order, or not enough order. Like everybody's trying to prophesy over the top of one another. That's not our problem. I mean, we have the opposite problem as Paul is addressing in this book. We like order too much. We like to play it safe and keep it predictable. We just prefer that nothing would get out of hand. And spiritual gifts are crowded out when we prioritize our need for things to be just right and just so. On the other hand, spiritual gifts tend to flourish when we prioritize them, when we make space for them. And that's something we're working on just doing more of as a church. Because it takes constant maintenance. Just keep prioritizing the supernatural because it's hard work. We're prioritizing and leaning into this as a church, but not how you'd maybe think. Because quite often when churches say, we want more of the gifts of the Spirit, what do? They invite in like a big name, somebody with prophet in their title. They invite in a big, revival speaker, and they put out the revival tent maybe, and they put on a big to-do. But that doesn't seem to be what's going on in Corinth. In 1 Corinthians 14, there's no big shots, no revivals. The spiritual gifts are just like an everyday part of life. And in fact, one of the sad things we see in the historic church is that the gifts of the Spirit are often crowded out by celebrity prophets and celebrity preachers. They're crowded out by Christian celebrity. So we're not really trying to bring in somebodies and big names or put on a big revival. But what we have been trying to do this year is live out 1 Corinthians 14 more faithfully. We're actually been trying to use this passage, 1 Corinthians 14:26, as sort of a guidebook for worship. You may not have noticed, but there are not many places in the Bible that tell us what to do at a church service. Like it doesn't come up a lot in the New Testament. And the reality is that in church today, we do a lot of things that never come up in the Bible. We do a lot of things that the Bible never instructs us to do. But we also don't do a few things that the Bible clearly tells us to do at church. And verse 26 puts it this way. What then shall we say, brothers and sisters? When you come together, each of you has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so that the church may be built up. I mean, each of you, when you gather, has a hymn, instruction, revelation, tongue, interpretation. We don't really do that, do we? Not in this environment, for all the reasons we just talked about. But over the last year, I've begun to think that church services actually work better when worship is crowdsourced. You know, you've heard of crowdsourcing? Like it's like a internet commerce kind of term. I think that's where it originated. Crowdsourcing. It's when you decide you're going to design some newfangled toilet scrubbing brush that works like automatically or something. And so you go to the internet and you put out this idea for a new toilet brush, and magically money flows to you. That's crowdsourcing. Not quite magical, but like people just emerge out of the woodwork to like give you money to make some new thing. That's crowdsourcing. If you have an idea, you ought to try it. Not in this church. We're not going to put you on our website, but you could try that. But I tend to think that worship was designed to be crowdsourced, and it flourishes when it's crowdsourced. In 1 Corinthians, I think spiritual gifts were flourishing because they were crowdsourced. And I'm hoping we've been working this last year at trying to build a more crowdsourced church because we believe that God actually gives gifts to the whole body. And different people have different things to contribute. But it's pretty hard to do in a room this size because as soon as you have a microphone, I mean, anything could happen. Like, as soon as you have a microphone in a room this size, it just makes everything weirder. Like, there's people out here, if I turn this on right now, like, doubtless there's somebody here that's always wanted to do karaoke at church. And if I said, hey, anybody want to come up and share a prayer? Like you've always wanted to have a microphone at church, and to do a big thing. Or you've thought, I would never talk in a microphone. Or still yet, when I've given a microphone to you, and I'm not counting or pointing out any fingers here, but when people take a microphone, time sort of speeds up. Have you noticed that? Like, it seems like I've only been talking for 30 seconds, but the clock says 30 minutes. It's about time to wind this sermon down. That just happens when you have a microphone. So we've been doing some other things this last year. We started gathering for the Eucharist around the Lord's Supper table at 9. And sometimes it's 30 or 40 people, and sometimes it's a dozen people. And it's been one of my favorite things we've done all year because there's no one really needs to lead it. We just let the liturgy sort of give a skeleton to it, and you get people praying some ritual rote prayers, and when the time comes, they're more than ready to pray prayers of the people or prophecies of the people, for that matter. I've noticed this last year that I've watched one of our newer believers who got baptized last Easter. Just a year ago would not even hardly look me in the eye. Was just so new to church, so new to this whole thing we do. And just a couple weeks ago, we were gathered around like this. It was on a Friday night at our Fire by Night gathering. And it came time, there was a word about prayer for some people going through an issue. And a young guy came forward. And my friend Diane just came over. And she just proceeded to share something really specific with him. And then she looked at me and she's like, did I do that right? Did I do that right? I said, you did exactly right. That is crowdsourcing worship. And she was given something that wasn't given to me. If we would have left it all up to the guy with the microphone and the podium, none of that work would have happened. It's hard to do that here with this many people, but we've been doing it on Friday nights, and you could come in a couple of weeks because we just gather in a circle, and there's room for everybody to share something. We don't tend to have the same problem they did in Corinth, where people are just jumping over each other. I usually have to kind of solicit it and encourage people, but we just see incredible things shared when we gather like that. And Paul just says, when you gather, somebody has a hymn, somebody has a word of instruction, somebody has a revelation, somebody has a tongue or an interpretation. And, that doesn't mean that we never prepare. We never, of course, I've been thinking about this sermon for the last week or two. And so you're not going to be given an opportunity today to give the word of instruction. But you might at 9 o'clock. You might when we're gathered in a small circle. We try to crowdsource worship, and that doesn't mean we never prepare, or that it's the best contributions are prepared in the moment. No, the best contributions to church are actually prepared all week long. If people who, like Mark, who've sat all week just laboring over, God, what do you want to say to your church this morning? How do you want us to participate in worshiping you? Or people who came on Friday night and said, just took time on a Friday night to just listen to God and ask him what he wanted to do in the church today. Or this morning, people who came early, we had a number of people who just listened and said, God, if there's anything you want to say to this church, would you say it to us now? And I'm going to have a few of them share in a moment, so that we can just learn how the early church functioned. The early church, as we said last week, was like a dinner party. It wasn't rows and pulpits and stages, and so this whole ambiance just makes it a little hard to do. And because of that, I'd encourage you, come out and check out on a Friday night or Sunday at 9 and see how we do this. It's a little nerve-wracking at first, just like dinner parties can be when you're the new one at the table. But that is the way God designed the church, that he would spread out the gifts around the body. That is the way God keeps the church from becoming too institutional, too celebrity-driven, too power-hungry, by just frustrating our attempts at making it, the Pastor Mike show. And so we're going to make some space for that now. So I want to invite up our band to come. As they do, I got a great story for you. One last story. We're going to, maybe somebody will come with a gift of tongues this morning. And that used to make me really nervous. I just thought, Paul says in this passage, there better be an interpretation. And the tough part is you don't really know if there's going to be an interpretation, do you? Not until you step out and take a risk. Well, years ago, I had invited a really good friend to church, and we were in high school at the time, and I thought, I really wanted him to, he'd been coming to the church for a couple of months, and I was hoping he could stay. But at the time, this church was kind of weird. Stuff just happened a lot. And so his parents came one week and to check us out, and they were from a very strict fundamentalist church. So the family showed up wearing suits and ties, and all the girls dressed in dresses, and they sat in the very back row. And I was just as nervous as could be because I thought, please God, don't let anything weird happen. Please God, you know how it is when you have a friend at church. You're please don't, nobody weird, just don't, let nothing weird happen. And of course, on that morning, it wasn't that common, but as the music ended, somebody just started yelling out in some kind of unknown language. And I just thought, oh no, I'm sunk. And I looked back over my shoulder as I've been doing all morning, and I noticed this guy in the suit, my friend's dad, started to get up out of his seat, and I thought, oh no, they're leaving. It's done for. And then something even worse happened. He got out of the row and he started walking up the aisle in this three-piece suit. And I thought, oh no, dear God, he's gonna chastise us all. He's gonna freak out on us. And he gets to the front and he turns around and he's got tears in his eyes. And he says, when that lady said that thing, I heard what she said. And he proceeded to interpret the whole thing. And it was just, it was crazy. And he still goes to this church. And he seems to have a knack for that. Actually, he's told me before that, usually when people speak in tongues, something just, he just hears it in English. It's just a strange thing, isn't it? But we're going to make some space for that. And you can buckle your seatbelt if you need to. You can take a coffee break if you need to. And we're going to just keep it from getting weird because Paul was pretty clear in this passage. This doesn't really help to just like turn people away or keep it mysterious or, certainly don't let it get crazy and ecstatic like the Corinthians did. We're just going to be normal. But to start, why don't you guys just, you could just begin to lead us in worship, and we'll just see what the Lord might want to lead us into. And you can go ahead and just stand or sit or kneel or whatever you'd like to do.